The desert wind carried the acrid smell of gunpowder and burning fuel across the rocky terrain of Afghanistan's Helmand province. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez adjusted her scope, watching the distant mountain ridges through the heat shimmer that danced above the sand. At 28, she had already earned a reputation as one of the most skilled marksmen in the Marine Corps, with over 200 confirmed kills during her 3 deployments. But nothing in her training had prepared her for what was about to unfold in the next 72 hours. The forward operating base buzzed with nervous energy as intelligence reports filtered in throughout the morning. Taliban forces had been moving through the valley in unprecedented numbers, and satellite imagery showed convoy after convoy of armed fighters converging on strategic positions throughout the region. Maria cleaned her M40A5 sniper rifle for the 3rd time that morning, a ritual that helped calm her nerves before major operations. Rodriguez, briefing room, now, called out Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, his weathered face betraying none of the concern that had been building since the intelligence reports began arriving. Maria slung her rifle across her shoulder and followed him through the maze of temporary structures that made up their base. The briefing room was packed with Marines from different units, their faces reflecting the same mixture of anticipation and apprehension that always preceded a major operation. Colonel Patricia Winters stood at the front of the room, her uniform crisp despite the oppressive heat. She was one of the few female officers to reach such a high rank in combat operations, and Maria had always respected her no-nonsense approach to leadership. The large screen behind her displayed a topographical map of the surrounding valley, marked with red circles indicating enemy positions and blue squares showing friendly forces. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a situation developing that requires immediate attention, Colonel Winters began, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of combat experience. Intelligence indicates that Taliban forces are preparing for a coordinated attack on multiple positions throughout this valley. Our mission is to establish observation posts at these key locations and provide early warning for any incoming threats. She clicked a remote, and the map zoomed in on a narrow canyon approximately 15 kilometers from their current position. Bravo Company will establish an observation post here, on the north ridge of Devil's Canyon. Charlie Company will take the south ridge, and Delta Company will provide support from the valley floor. The operation is scheduled to commence at 0600 hours tomorrow. Maria studied the map carefully, noting the steep terrain and limited escape routes. The canyon was a natural choke point, perfect for observation, but also incredibly vulnerable if enemy forces managed to surround the positions. She raised her hand, and Colonel Winters nodded for her to speak. "Ma'am, what's our extraction plan if things go sideways?" "Those ridges don't offer many options for helicopter landing zones," Maria asked, voicing the concern that she could see reflected in the faces of several other Marines. "Valid concern, Rodriguez. We'll have helicopter support on standby, but the primary extraction route will be through the valley floor, covered by Delta Company. The terrain is challenging, but intelligence suggests minimal enemy presence in the immediate area," Colonel Winters replied, though something in her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by the intelligence assessment. The briefing continued for another hour, covering everything from communication protocols to rules of engagement. Maria took detailed notes, paying particular attention to the radio frequencies and call signs that would be critical if communications broke down. She had learned from previous deployments that Murphy's Law applied especially strongly in combat situations, and proper preparation could mean the difference between life and death. After the briefing, Maria spent the remainder of the day checking and rechecking her equipment. Her sniper rifle was pristine, each component cleaned and lubricated to perfection. She packed extra ammunition, water, and medical supplies, knowing that resupply might be difficult once they reached the observation posts. Her spotter, Corporal Jake Thompson, worked beside her with the same methodical attention to detail. "You ever get the feeling that something's not right about this mission?" Jake asked quietly, keeping his voice low enough that nearby Marines couldn't overhear. At 22, he was relatively new to combat operations, but he had good instincts and Maria had learned to trust his judgment. "Every mission feels wrong until it's over," Maria replied, though she shared his concerns. "The intelligence seems thin, and that canyon is a natural killing field if the enemy manages to get positioned correctly. But orders are orders, and we'll adapt to whatever situation develops." That evening, Maria called her younger sister Elena back home in California. The satellite phone connection was scratchy, but hearing Elena's voice always helped settle her nerves before a mission. Elena was finishing her final year of nursing school, and she always worried about Maria's safety during deployments. "How are you holding up out there, sis?" Elena asked, her concern evident even through the poor connection. "Mom's been watching the news constantly, and she's worried sick about you." "Just another day in paradise," Maria joked, trying to keep the conversation light. She couldn't discuss the details of upcoming operations, but she always tried to reassure her family without outright lying about the dangers she faced. "Tell Mom I love her and that I'll be home for Christmas just like I promised." They talked for another few minutes about Elena's studies and their mother's health before the connection began to fade. Maria promised to call again as soon as she could, knowing that it might be several days before she had another opportunity. The weight of family responsibility always felt heavier before dangerous missions, but it also provided motivation to complete the mission successfully and return home safely. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by the sound of helicopters taking off and landing at regular intervals. Maria dozed between the mechanical noises, her mind automatically processing the sounds and determining whether they represented routine operations or potential threats. Years of deployment had taught her to sleep with one ear, always listening for danger. At 0500 hours, Maria's alarm buzzed softly in her ear. She had learned to wake up without disturbing her tent mates, and she moved quietly through her pre-mission routine. A quick breakfast of MRE beef stew provided the calories she would need for what promised to be a physically demanding day, and she filled her water bottles from the purification station. The helicopter that would transport them to the observation post was a CHF-47 Chinook, its twin rotors already spinning as Maria and her team approached. The pilot, Chief Warrant Officer David Chen, had flown them on several previous missions, and his skill in difficult terrain was legendary among the Marines. He greeted Maria with a nod as she climbed aboard, his expression serious but confident. The flight to Devil's Canyon took approximately 20 minutes, during which Maria reviewed the mission parameters one final time. Bravo Company consisted of 40 Marines who would establish the North Ridge observation post, while Charlie Company's 35 Marines would take the South Ridge. Delta Company's 60 Marines would remain in the valley to provide support and secure potential extraction routes. As the helicopter approached the landing zone, Maria could see the dramatic landscape spread out below them. The canyon was deeper than the satellite photos had indicated, with sheer rock walls rising several hundred feet on both sides. The ridges were narrow and exposed, offering excellent fields of fire but minimal protection from enemy observation or indirect fire. The helicopter touched down briefly on a small clearing near the base of the North Ridge, and Maria's team quickly disembarked with their equipment. The rotor wash kicked up clouds of dust and sand, forcing everyone to shield their eyes until the aircraft lifted off and headed toward the South Ridge to drop off Charlie Company. Captain Michael Torres, the commanding officer of Bravo Company, gathered his Marines in a defensive circle while they oriented themselves to the terrain. The climb to the observation post would be challenging, requiring them to carry their equipment up a steep slope covered with loose rocks and scattered boulders. "All right, Marines, let's move out. Rodriguez, I want you and Thompson to establish overwatch positions as we climb. If there's anyone watching us, I want to know about it before they get a chance to cause problems," Captain Torres ordered, his voice carrying the confidence that had earned him the respect of his men. Maria nodded and began scanning the surrounding ridges through her scope while Jake used his spotting scope to examine the valley floor and opposite canyon wall. The morning sun was beginning to heat the rocks, creating thermals that would affect long-range shooting, but the visibility was excellent. The climb took nearly 2 hours, with frequent stops to rest and maintain security. Maria's position as the unit's designated marksman meant she was responsible for providing overwatch during movement, constantly scanning for potential threats, while the rest of the company maneuvered. Her rifle felt comfortable in her hands, its weight distributed perfectly for extended periods of carry. About halfway up the ridge, Jake suddenly stiffened beside her. "Movement on the south wall, approximately 800 meters, he whispered, adjusting his spotting scope to get a clearer view. "Looks like 2 individuals moving among the rocks near the top of Charlie Company's objective." Maria swung her rifle toward the indicated location and peered through her scope. After several seconds of careful observation, she spotted the movement Jake had detected. Two figures in traditional Afghan clothing were picking their way carefully along the ridge, apparently unaware that they were being observed. "Could be civilians, but they're moving like they have military training," Maria observed quietly. "The way they're using cover and concealment suggests they know what they're doing. I'm going to report this to Captain Torres." She keyed her radio and reported the sighting to the company commander, who immediately passed the information to Colonel Winters at the base. The response came back quickly. "Observe and report, but do not engage unless directly threatened." The rules of engagement were clear, but Maria couldn't shake the feeling that those two figures represented a threat that would soon become much more serious. By noon, Bravo Company had established their observation post on a rocky outcropping that provided excellent visibility in all directions. Maria positioned herself at the northern edge of the position, where she could cover the most likely avenues of approach while maintaining communication with the rest of the unit. Jake set up beside her with his spotting scope and radio equipment, creating an efficient two-man sniper team. The view from their position was breathtaking and terrifying in equal measure. The canyon stretched out below them like a giant scar in the earth, its walls carved by millions of years of wind and water erosion. To the south, they could see Charlie Company's position on the opposite ridge, their Marines barely visible as small figures moving among the rocks. "This place gives me the creeps," Jake muttered, adjusting his scope to examine a suspicious shadow on the valley floor. "It's too quiet, and there are too many places for bad guys to hide without us seeing them until it's too late." Maria understood his concerns, but she was more focused on the tactical advantages their position offered. With proper fields of fire and good communication, they could provide early warning for a significant portion of the valley. The key would be maintaining vigilance and staying alert for any signs of enemy activity. Around 1400 hours, the first indication of trouble came not from visual observation but from radio intercepts. The intelligence team at the base had been monitoring Taliban radio frequencies, and they began picking up increased chatter, indicating that enemy forces were aware of the American positions in Devil's Canyon. "Bravo Company, this is base. Be advised that signals intelligence indicates enemy awareness of your position. Recommend increased vigilance and preparation for possible contact," came the message from Colonel Winters, her voice maintaining its professional calm despite the ominous implications. Captain Torres acknowledged the transmission and immediately ordered his Marines to improve their defensive positions. Maria and Jake began a systematic survey of all possible enemy positions within rifle range, identifying potential sniper hides and approach routes that could threaten their observation post. As the afternoon wore on, the temperature climbed into the triple digits, and the Marines began showing signs of heat stress despite their acclimatization training. Maria rationed her water carefully, knowing that resupply would be difficult if the situation deteriorated. The heat also affected her rifle's performance, requiring constant adjustment of her scope to account for the changing atmospheric conditions. At 16:30 hours, the situation changed dramatically. Jake, who had been monitoring the radio while Maria maintained watch, suddenly grabbed her arm. "Maria, you need to hear this. Charlie Company just reported movement on multiple ridges surrounding the canyon. Looks like we're about to have company." Maria switched to the company frequency and immediately heard the tension in the voices of the Marines on the south ridge. They were reporting armed groups moving into positions that would effectively surround the canyon, cutting off the planned extraction routes through the valley floor. "Bravo Company, this is Charlie 6. We have visual confirmation of armed groups moving into blocking positions. Estimate at least 200 enemy fighters, possibly more. Our extraction route appears to be compromised," came the report from Charlie Company's commanding officer, Major Sarah Williams. Captain Torres's response was immediate and decisive. "Roger, Charlie 6. We're observing similar movement from our position. Bays, this is Bravo 6. Request immediate extraction and close air support. The situation is developing rapidly, and we may be cut off within the hour." The response from Colonel Winters came back with an edge of urgency that hadn't been there before. "Bravo 6. Helicopter extraction is not possible at this time due to enemy anti-aircraft threats. Delta Company is moving to secure alternate extraction routes, but you need to maintain your positions and provide intelligence on enemy movements." Maria felt a chill despite the oppressive heat. Anti-aircraft threats meant the enemy had come prepared for this engagement. suggesting a level of planning and coordination that exceeded anything in the intelligence briefings. She began scanning the surrounding terrain with renewed intensity, looking for any sign of surface-to-air missiles or other anti-aircraft weapons. The next few hours passed with agonizing slowness, as both Marine companies reported increasing enemy activity throughout the valley. Groups of armed fighters were moving into positions that would allow them to engage the observation posts with small arms fire, while larger formations appeared to be establishing blocking positions that would prevent any ground-based extraction. As the sun began to set behind the western ridge, painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and red, Maria counted at least 50 enemy positions within her field of view. Each position contained between 2 and 5 fighters, all armed with assault rifles and rocket-propelled grenades. The mathematical calculation was simple and terrifying. The combined Marine force of 75 men was about to be attacked by several hundred, well-armed and well-positioned enemy fighters. Jake, start plotting coordinates for every enemy position you can identify. We're going to need accurate fire missions if we have any chance of breaking out of this, Maria ordered, her voice remaining calm despite the desperate nature of their situation. As darkness fell over Devil's Canyon, the first shots rang out from the South Ridge. Charlie Company was under attack, their position illuminated by muzzle flashes and the bright streaks of tracer rounds. Maria watched through her scope as the Marines on the opposite ridge fought desperately to maintain their position against overwhelming odds. The battle for Devil's Canyon had begun, and Maria Rodriguez was about to face the most challenging 72 hours of her military career. The lives of nearly 500 Marines would soon depend on her skills as a sniper, and her willingness to defy orders when following protocol meant leaving her fellow Marines to die. The first enemy rounds cracked overhead at exactly 21:15 hours, their distinctive snap confirming Maria's worst fears about their tactical situation. The Taliban fighters had positioned themselves with military precision, creating interlocking fields of fire that would make any movement extremely dangerous for the Marines trapped on both ridges. Through her night vision scope, Maria could see muzzle flashes erupting from at least 15 different positions across the valley floor and surrounding ridges. The enemy had waited until darkness to launch their attack, knowing that the limited visibility would favor the defenders who knew the terrain intimately. Bravo 6, this is Rodriguez. I have positive identification on multiple enemy firing positions. Request permission to engage. Maria transmitted, her finger resting lightly on her rifle's trigger as she tracked a particularly active enemy position approximately 600 meters away. Captain Torres's response came immediately. Rodriguez, you are cleared to engage any target that poses an immediate threat to this position. Make your shots count. We're going to need every advantage we can get. Maria's first shot took out an enemy fighter who had been directing fire from a prominent rock outcropping. The sound of her rifle was different from the lighter crack of the enemy's AK-47s, and she saw several muzzle flashes immediately turn in her direction as the Taliban fighters tried to locate the source of the precise shot. Jake worked beside her with quiet efficiency, calling out targets and adjusting for wind and distance. RPG team moving into position, bearing 270 degrees, range 800 meters. He whispered, his voice barely audible above the increasing volume of gunfire echoing throughout the canyon. Maria swung her rifle toward the indicated position and quickly acquired the target through her scope. The rocket-propelled grenade team was setting up behind a low stone wall, clearly preparing to engage the Marine positions with indirect fire. Her shot took out the gunner just as he was shouldering the weapon, and the resulting explosion as the RPG detonated prematurely eliminated the rest of the team. The radio traffic increased dramatically as both Marine companies began reporting their situations. Charlie Company was taking heavy fire from multiple directions, and several Marines had already been wounded in the initial exchange. Delta Company, positioned in the valley floor, was attempting to move toward the ridges but was encountering heavy resistance from enemy blocking positions. All stations. This is base. Air support is inbound. Estimated time of arrival 45 minutes. Maintain your positions and mark target locations for close air support. Colonel Winters transmitted, her voice providing a steadying influence despite the chaotic situation developing in the canyon. 45 minutes felt like an eternity as Maria continued to engage enemy targets while monitoring the deteriorating tactical situation. Through her scope, she could see that the Taliban fighters were using sophisticated tactics, moving in coordinated groups and maintaining disciplined fire control. This wasn't the disorganized militia they had faced in previous engagements. Around 2200 hours, the situation became critical when Charlie Company reported that they were running low on ammunition and had sustained multiple casualties. The enemy had managed to get close enough to their position to engage with grenades and close-range automatic weapons fire. Bravo 6, this is Charlie 6. We have 4 wounded and critically low on ammunition. Request immediate resupply or will be overrun within the hour. Major Williams transmitted, the stress evident in her voice despite her professional composure. Maria looked toward the south ridge and could see the intensity of the fire directed at Charlie Company's position. The enemy had concentrated their attack on the smaller force, apparently hoping to eliminate one of the observation posts before turning their full attention to the remaining Marines. Jake, we need to take pressure off Charlie Company. Start identifying targets that are engaging their position. Maria ordered, adjusting her scope to focus on the enemy fighters who were closest to overrunning the south ridge. For the next 30 minutes, Maria worked methodically through a list of priority targets, each shot carefully aimed to maximize the impact on enemy capabilities. She eliminated machine gun teams, RPG crews, and what appeared to be tactical leaders who were coordinating the assault on Charlie Company. The arrival of close air support at 22:45 hours provided temporary relief, as FA-18 Hornets began engaging enemy positions with precision-guided munitions. The sound of jet engines screaming overhead was followed by massive explosions that lit up the canyon walls and temporarily silenced the enemy fire. However, the air support could only remain on station for limited periods due to fuel constraints, and Maria realized that the Taliban fighters were simply taking cover during the air attacks and resuming their assault as soon as the aircraft departed. The enemy had clearly planned for this contingency and were prepared for a prolonged engagement. Around midnight, the situation took a dramatic turn for the worse. Colonel Winters transmitted an emergency message that changed everything. All stations, this is base. Intelligence reports indicate that additional enemy forces are moving to reinforce the canyon positions. Estimated 2,000 fighters converging on your location. Higher Command has ordered an immediate withdrawal to prevent total loss of forces. The message was followed by specific evacuation orders that struck Maria like a physical blow. Due to the anti-aircraft threat and the deteriorating tactical situation, helicopter extraction was impossible. The Marines in the canyon would have to fight their way out on foot, but only those who could move under their own power would be evacuated. Charlie Company reports 4 wounded who cannot be moved without assistance. Delta Company has sustained heavy casualties and requests medical evacuation for 7 Marines. Came the follow-up transmission that confirmed Maria's worst fears. Captain Torres gathered his squad leaders for a hasty planning session while Maria maintained overwatch. Through her scope, she could see that the enemy forces were indeed being reinforced, with new groups of fighters moving into positions that would make any evacuation extremely difficult. The orders are clear, Marines. We extract immediately with only those personnel who can move independently. Wounded personnel who cannot keep up with the evacuation will be left behind with medical supplies and radio equipment. Higher Command believes that extraction will be possible once additional forces arrive in the area, Captain Torres explained, his voice betraying the emotional difficulty of delivering such orders. Maria felt sick to her stomach as she processed the implications. Leaving wounded Marines behind went against every principle she had learned during her military training and combat experience. The idea that fellow Marines would be abandoned to almost certain death or capture was unthinkable. Sir, what's the timeline for the follow-up extraction? How long before additional forces arrive to get our wounded out? Asked Sergeant First Class Robert Martinez, voicing the question that was on everyone's mind. Intelligence estimates 24 to 48 hours depending on enemy resistance and available helicopter assets, Captain Torres replied, though his tone suggested he didn't believe the optimistic timeline himself. Jake leaned close to Maria and whispered, "You know they're never coming back for those Marines. 24 hours in this tactical situation means they'll all be dead or captured long before any rescue force can reach them." Maria nodded grimly, understanding that the wounded Marines were being written off as acceptable casualties in a larger strategic calculation. The mathematics of warfare sometimes required such decisions, but that didn't make them any easier to accept. The evacuation began at 0130 hours, with Bravo Company moving carefully down the North Ridge while maintaining security against continued enemy harassment. Maria served as rear guard, using her sniper rifle to discourage pursuit while the rest of the company descended toward the valley floor. Through her scope, she could see Charlie Company's position on the South Ridge, where 4 wounded Marines had been left behind, with a single corpsman and a radio operator who had volunteered to stay with them. The small group had taken cover in a defensible position among the rocks, but they were clearly outnumbered and surrounded. The evacuation route led through a narrow section of the canyon where Delta Company was supposed to maintain a corridor for the withdrawing forces. However, enemy pressure had forced them to fall back to more defensible positions, leaving a gap in coverage that would have to be crossed under fire. As Bravo Company approached the danger area, enemy fire increased significantly. Taliban fighters had positioned themselves on both sides of the evacuation route, creating a deadly crossfire that forced the Marines to move in small groups while maintaining suppressive fire. Maria positioned herself to provide overwatch for the movement, engaging enemy targets that threatened the evacuating Marines. Her ammunition was running low after hours of sustained shooting, and she had to make every shot count as the situation became increasingly desperate. Around 0300 hours, disaster struck when an enemy RPG team managed to get close enough to engage Delta Company's rearguard position. The explosion killed 3 Marines and wounded several others, including Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who had been coordinating the evacuation from that position. This is Delta 6 Alpha. Delta 6 is down. Repeat, Delta 6 is down. We have multiple casualties and are taking heavy fire from 3 directions. Requesting immediate assistance, came the panicked transmission from Delta Company's senior sergeant. Captain Torres made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. With his own company barely managing to maintain its evacuation route and enemy pressure increasing on all sides, he determined that Delta Company's casualties would also have to be left behind. Delta 6 Alpha, this is Bravo 6. Maintain your position and provide covering fire for our withdrawal. Medical supplies and ammunition will be dropped at your location, and extraction will follow as soon as possible. Torres transmitted, knowing that he was essentially condemning more Marines to death or capture. Maria watched through her scope as the tactical situation collapsed completely. Enemy forces were closing in from multiple directions, and the narrow window for evacuation was rapidly closing. In less than 30 minutes, the remaining mobile forces would be trapped in the canyon along with their wounded comrades. The decision that would define the rest of her career came to Maria at 0330 hours, as she watched enemy fighters moving to surround the trapped Marines. Protocol demanded that she continue with the evacuation, following orders to preserve the maximum number of lives possible. But every fiber of her being rebelled against leaving fellow Marines to die without attempting a rescue. Jake must have sensed her internal struggle, because he grabbed her arm as they prepared to follow Bravo Company down the evacuation route. Maria, don't even think about it. We follow orders, and we live to fight another day. That's how this works. Maria looked back toward Charlie Company's position where 6 Marines were making a desperate last stand, and then toward Delta Company's location where Lieutenant Colonel Harrison lay wounded among the rocks. The mathematical calculation was simple. One sniper could not significantly change the outcome of such an overwhelming tactical disadvantage, but mathematics had never governed Maria's approach to warfare. She had joined the Marines because she believed in the principle that no Marine would be left behind, and she could not reconcile that belief with the orders she was being given. Jake, you continue with the company. Tell Captain Torres that I'm going to provide additional overwatch to cover the evacuation, Maria said, knowing that she was lying to her spotter and closest friend in the unit. Maria, don't do this. You're talking about throwing your life away for Marines who are already as good as dead. The smart play is to follow orders and live to serve another day, Jake pleaded, understanding exactly what she was planning despite her careful words. Maria shouldered her rifle and checked her remaining ammunition. 6 magazines remained, along with her sidearm and a combat knife. It wasn't much against several hundred enemy fighters, but it would have to be enough. Tell my sister that I love her, and that I did what I thought was right, Maria said, disappearing into the rocks before Jake could stop her. Behind her, she could hear him arguing with Captain Torres over the radio, trying to convince the company commander to order her return. But Maria Rodriguez was done following orders that violated her core beliefs about what it meant to be a Marine. For the next 48 hours, she would operate independently, using her skills as a sniper to do everything possible to keep her fellow Marines alive until a real extraction could be organized. The enemy had made a critical error in their tactical planning. They had accounted for conventional Marine tactics and standard evacuation procedures, but they had not planned for a single sniper who was willing to defy orders and sacrifice herself to save others. As Maria moved through the darkness toward Charlie Company's position, she began to formulate a plan that would require every skill she had developed during 3 combat deployments. The odds were impossible, but she had never been the kind of person who accepted defeat simply because the mathematics were unfavorable. The battle for Devil's Canyon was entering its most critical phase, and Maria Rodriguez was about to demonstrate what a single Marine could accomplish when fighting for principles that mattered more than following orders. Moving through the rocky terrain in complete darkness required every skill Maria had developed during her years as a scout sniper. She moved slowly and deliberately, testing each footstep before committing her full weight and constantly scanning for enemy sentries who might be positioned between her current location and Charlie Company's desperate position on the South Ridge. The sound of gunfire had decreased somewhat as the main evacuation force moved through the valley, but Maria could still hear sporadic shooting from both Charlie Company's position and the area where Delta Company's wounded had been left behind. Each gunshot represented Marines fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds, and every minute that passed reduced their chances of survival. Through her night vision scope, Maria could see that the Taliban fighters had reorganized their positions following the main evacuation. Rather than pursuing the withdrawing Marines, they had concentrated their forces around the trapped wounded, apparently recognizing that these isolated groups presented easier targets than a mobile force with heavy weapon support. The tactical situation was even worse than she had feared. Charlie Company's 6 Marines were surrounded by at least 40 enemy fighters who had moved into positions that provided complete coverage of all possible escape routes. The small group had taken shelter among a cluster of large boulders, but their defensive position was slowly being compressed as the enemy tightened their cordon. Delta Company's situation was equally desperate, with the wounded Marines trapped in a shallow depression that provided minimal cover from increasingly accurate enemy fire. Maria could see muzzle flashes from at least 30 different positions surrounding their location, and it was clear that the enemy was preparing for a final assault that would overrun both isolated groups. At 0400 hours, Maria reached a position approximately 300 meters from Charlie Company's defensive perimeter. From this vantage point, she could observe both the trapped Marines and the enemy forces that were methodically closing in on their position. The mathematical calculation remained daunting. One sniper with limited ammunition against overwhelming numbers of well-positioned enemy fighters. Maria's approach to the tactical problem was methodical and professional, drawing on years of training in unconventional warfare and asymmetric tactics. Rather than attempting a direct assault that would quickly result in her death, she began implementing a strategy of psychological warfare designed to disrupt enemy coordination and create confusion about the number of Marines still active in the canyon. Her first target was an enemy machine gun position that had been directing sustained fire at Charlie Company's location. The gunner was clearly visible through her scope, and her shot eliminated him instantly. However, instead of immediately moving to a new position as standard sniper doctrine dictated, Maria remained in place and waited for the enemy response. As expected, the enemy fighters began concentrating fire on her position, assuming that she represented a significant threat to their tactical plan. While they focused their attention on locating and eliminating her, the pressure on Charlie Company decreased significantly, allowing the trapped Marines to improve their defensive positions and treat their wounded. After 15 minutes of sustained enemy fire directed at her position, Maria moved carefully to a new location approximately 100 meters away. From this position, she engaged a different enemy group that had been preparing to assault Charlie Company from the eastern approach. Her shots were carefully aimed to create maximum psychological impact, targeting apparent leaders and heavy weapons crews. The enemy response confirmed that her strategy was working. Instead of continuing their coordinated assault on the trapped Marines, the Taliban fighters began deploying significant resources to locate and eliminate the sniper who was disrupting their operations. There, Maria counted at least 60 fighters who had been diverted from the assault on Charlie Company to search for her position. Around 0500, Maria established radio contact with the trapped Marines using an encrypted frequency that was less likely to be monitored by enemy forces. The voice that answered belonged to Corporal David Kim, the senior unwounded Marine with Charlie Company. This is Rodriguez. What's your status? And how many effectives do you have? Maria transmitted, keeping her voice low to avoid detection by nearby enemy patrols. Rodriguez, thank God. We have 2 Marines who can fight. 4 wounded, including Major Williams, who's unconscious from blood loss. We're critically low on ammunition and medical supplies. The corpsman says Williams needs evacuation within 6 hours or she's going to die. Kim responded, the stress and exhaustion evident in his voice. Maria processed this information while continuing to scan for enemy targets. Major Williams had been commanding Charlie Company since the beginning of the deployment, and she was one of the most experienced combat leaders in the battalion. Losing her would be a significant blow to unit morale, but more importantly, she had a husband and 2 young children waiting for her return. Kim, I'm going to create a diversion that should draw enemy forces away from your position. When I do, you need to move to the western side of your perimeter and establish a new defensive position among those larger rocks. Can you move your wounded that distance? Maria asked, studying the terrain through her scope, to identify the best defensive position for the small group. We can move them, but it's going to be risky. Williams is unconscious and Peterson has a leg wound that prevents him from walking unassisted. Kim replied, clearly understanding that any movement would expose his Marines to enemy fire. I'll provide covering fire and keep their attention focused elsewhere. Move when you hear my shot, and don't stop moving until you reach the new position, Maria ordered, selecting a high-value target that would force the enemy to respond to her location rather than focusing on the moving Marines. Her next shot eliminated an enemy commander who had been coordinating the assault from a prominent position overlooking Charlie Company's perimeter. The immediate response was exactly what she had hoped for. Dozens of enemy fighters began moving toward her position while the remaining forces focused their fire on the area where they believed she was hiding. During the confusion, Kim and his remaining Marines successfully moved their wounded to the new defensive position, which provided better cover and multiple escape routes if the situation continued to deteriorate. The movement required 20 minutes of careful maneuvering, during which Maria engaged multiple targets to keep enemy attention focused away from the relocating Marines. By 0600 hours, the eastern sky was beginning to show the first hints of dawn, which would significantly change the tactical dynamic of the engagement. Daylight would make Maria's movements much more dangerous, but it would also provide better visibility for engaging enemy targets at longer ranges. Maria established her next position on a rocky outcropping that provided excellent fields of fire toward both Charlie Company's new location and the area where Delta Company's wounded were trapped. From this vantage point, she could see that the enemy had indeed diverted significant resources to hunting for her, with at least 80 fighters now involved in the search operation. The psychological impact of her presence was even greater than she had hoped. The enemy fighters were moving cautiously and maintaining poor tactical discipline as they searched for a threat they couldn't locate or quantify. Many of them were firing at shadows and false targets, wasting ammunition and revealing their positions to her observation. At 0630 hours, Maria made radio contact with Delta Company's survivors, reaching Sergeant First Class Martinez, who had assumed command after Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was wounded in the RPG attack. Martinez, this is Rodriguez. What's your situation down there? Maria transmitted, adjusting her scope to examine the area where she knew the wounded Marines were trapped. Rodriguez, we have 5 wounded, including the colonel, and 3 effectives. We're taking sporadic sniper fire from multiple directions, and they're getting closer. Colonel Harrison is stable but needs medical attention for internal injuries. We've got maybe 2 hours of ammunition left at current expenditure rates, Martinez replied, his professional composure intact despite the desperate circumstances. Maria studied the terrain around Delta Company's position and realized that their tactical situation was actually more favorable than Charlie Company's location. The depression they occupied provided good cover from direct fire, and the surrounding rocks offered multiple positions where a sniper could provide effective overwatch. Martinez, I'm going to move to a position where I can provide direct fire support for your location. When I get established, I want you to consolidate your wounded in the center of your perimeter and establish 2-man fighting positions on the eastern and western approaches, Maria ordered, already planning her movement to a rocky ridge that overlooked the entire area. The movement to the new position required 45 minutes of careful stalking through terrain that was increasingly illuminated by the rising sun. Maria had to avoid multiple enemy patrols that were searching for her. using every technique she had learned in Scout Sniper School to remain undetected while carrying her heavy rifle and limited supplies. From her new position, Maria could see the full scope of the tactical situation for the first time. The canyon contained approximately 400 enemy fighters organized into coherent units with apparent command structure and communication systems. They had established interlocking fields of fire that covered all possible escape routes, and they were methodically tightening their control over the areas where the trapped Marines were located. But Maria also noticed something that gave her hope. The enemy fighters were showing signs of fatigue and reduced alertness after hours of sustained combat operations. Many of them had clustered together in positions that offered good protection but poor fields of fire, suggesting that they were more concerned with personal safety than tactical effectiveness. At 07:15 hours, Maria began the most intensive period of sniper activity in her military career. Using the superior visibility provided by daylight, she systematically engaged enemy positions that posed the greatest threat to both groups of trapped Marines. Her shooting was methodical and precise, with each shot carefully planned to maximize both its immediate tactical impact and its psychological effect on enemy morale. Her first target was an enemy sniper who had been directing accurate fire at Delta Company's position. The shot was taken at a range of nearly 800 meters, requiring careful calculation for wind drift and bullet drop. The enemy sniper's elimination immediately reduced the pressure on Martinez and his Marines, allowing them to improve their defensive positions. Maria's second shot eliminated a machine gun crew that had been preparing to engage Charlie Company from a new angle. The gunner's death caused the remaining crew members to abandon their position and seek cover in a less advantageous location, further reducing the threat to Kim and his wounded Marines. For the next 2 hours, Maria methodically worked through a target list that included heavy weapons crews, apparent tactical leaders, and enemy fighters who were positioned to threaten the trapped Marines. Each shot was taken from a different position, requiring her to move constantly to avoid enemy counter-sniper fire. The psychological impact on enemy forces was profound and measurable. Instead of maintaining coordinated pressure on both groups of trapped Marines, the Taliban fighters became increasingly focused on locating and eliminating the sniper, who was systematically destroying their tactical plan. Unit cohesion began to break down as individual fighters prioritized personal survival over mission accomplishment. Around 0908, Maria observed something that changed her entire approach to the tactical problem. A group of approximately 50 enemy fighters was moving through the valley in a formation that suggested they were either reinforcements arriving from outside the canyon or a reserve force being repositioned to deal with the sniper threat. Through her scope, she could see that this group was better equipped and more disciplined than the fighters she had been engaging throughout the night. They moved with the tactical proficiency that suggested formal military training, and their equipment included several heavy weapons systems that could significantly escalate the threat to the trapped Marines. Maria realized that the arrival of this new enemy force would overwhelm her ability to protect both groups of Marines simultaneously. The mathematical calculation had changed again, and she needed to make a strategic decision about where to focus her limited resources for maximum effect. The decision was made easier when she observed the new enemy force moving directly toward Delta Company's position, apparently planning to eliminate that group of Marines before turning their attention to Charlie Company. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was among the wounded in that location, and his capture or death would represent a significant intelligence and propaganda victory for the Taliban. Maria began moving toward a position that would allow her to intercept the advancing enemy force before they could reach Delta Company's perimeter. The movement required her to cross open ground that was observed by multiple enemy positions, but the risk was necessary to prevent the situation from becoming completely hopeless. As she moved through the rocky terrain, Maria reflected on the series of decisions that had brought her to this point. Military doctrine and direct orders had required her to evacuate with her unit, abandoning the wounded Marines to their fate. But her personal code of ethics had made that choice impossible, even though it meant almost certain death in a tactically hopeless situation. The irony was not lost on her that she was probably saving Marines who would die anyway when her ammunition ran out and the enemy forces finally located her position. But every hour she could keep them alive increased the possibility that a real rescue operation might be organized, and every enemy fighter she eliminated was one less threat to future Marine operations in the region. At 09:45 hours, Maria reached her final firing position overlooking the route that the advancing enemy force would use to reach Delta Company. From this location, she could engage targets at ranges up to 1,000 meters. But she would also be exposed to return fire from multiple directions once her position was identified. As she prepared for what might be her final engagement, Maria thought about her sister Elena and the promise she had made to return home for Christmas. That promise would probably be broken, but she had never regretted choosing a path that prioritized honor and loyalty over personal safety. The approaching enemy force was now within range, and Maria began the engagement that would determine whether Lieutenant Colonel Harrison and his Marines lived or died. The odds remained impossible, but Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had never been intimidated by unfavorable mathematics when the lives of fellow Marines were at stake. The advancing enemy force moved with the disciplined precision of professional soldiers, maintaining proper spacing and security as they approached Delta Company's defensive position. Through her scope, Maria could see that their equipment included mortars, heavy machine guns, and what appeared to be improvised explosive devices designed to breach the Marines' defensive perimeter. Maria's first shot targeted the apparent leader of the advancing force, a tall man carrying sophisticated radio equipment who was directing the movement from a position slightly behind the main formation. The range was nearly 900 meters, requiring precise calculation for wind drift and the effects of the morning thermal currents rising from the heated canyon floor. The shot was perfect, eliminating the enemy commander and immediately causing confusion in the advancing formation. Without clear leadership, the disciplined movement began to break down as individual fighters sought cover and tried to determine the source of the accurate fire that had killed their leader. But the confusion was temporary, and within minutes, a new leader emerged to reorganize the assault. Maria's second shot eliminated this individual as well, but she realized that the enemy force included multiple capable leaders who could maintain unit cohesion despite casualties. The psychological impact of losing two commanders in quick succession was significant, but it also had the unintended consequence of making the remaining enemy fighters more cautious and difficult to engage. They began using better cover and movement techniques, making individual targets harder to acquire and engage. Around 1000 hours, the tactical situation changed dramatically when Maria observed enemy mortar crews setting up positions that would allow them to engage both groups of trapped Marines with indirect fire. The mortars represented a threat that she could not effectively counter with rifle fire alone, and their successful employment would likely result in the deaths of all remaining Marines in the canyon. Maria's decision to abandon her current position and assault the mortar crews directly violated every principle of sniper employment she had learned during her military career. Snipers were supposed to engage targets at long range while remaining concealed and protected, not conduct direct assaults against superior numbers in open terrain. But the tactical situation left her no choice. The mortars had to be eliminated before they could be used against the trapped Marines, even if it meant exposing herself to almost certain death or capture. Maria shouldered her rifle and began moving toward the enemy mortar positions, using every available piece of cover to minimize her exposure to return fire. The movement took 20 minutes of careful maneuvering through terrain that was increasingly populated with enemy fighters searching for her position. Twice she had to eliminate enemy sentries who discovered her movement, using her combat knife to avoid the sound of gunfire that would alert nearby fighters to her location. At 10:20 hours, Maria reached a position approximately 50 meters from the nearest mortar crew. From this close range, she could see that the enemy had established 3 separate mortar positions, each manned by 4 fighters and protected by additional security personnel positioned in the surrounding rocks. Her assault on the first mortar position was swift and devastating. Using her rifle's semi-automatic capability, she eliminated all 4 crew members in less than 10 seconds before they could react to her presence. However, the sound of sustained rifle fire immediately alerted the other mortar crews and their security elements to her exact location. The next 5 minutes tested every skill Maria had developed during 3 combat deployments. Enemy fighters converged on her position from multiple directions, forcing her to move constantly while engaging targets that were often within 100 meters of her location. The intensity of the gunfire was overwhelming, with bullets striking rocks and sand all around her position. Maria's second assault eliminated the crew of the middle mortar position, but by this time the enemy fighters had organized a coordinated response to her attack. She found herself trapped in a small cluster of rocks with enemy forces approaching from 3 directions and limited ammunition remaining for her rifle. The tactical situation was hopeless by any reasonable military standard, but Maria had passed beyond normal tactical considerations hours earlier. She was operating purely on instinct and determination, using every weapon and technique at her disposal to continue the fight for as long as physically possible. Her transition to her sidearm came when her rifle ammunition was finally exhausted after eliminating the third mortar crew. The pistol provided limited range and stopping power compared to her sniper rifle, but it was better suited to the close-range engagements that characterized her current tactical situation. At 10:40 hours, Maria's desperate fight was interrupted by a sound that she had not expected to hear: the distinctive noise of helicopter rotors approaching the canyon at high speed. Through the smoke and dust of the ongoing engagement, she could see a formation of 4 CH-47 Chinook helicopters escorted by 2 HH-64 Apache attack helicopters flying directly toward the trapped Marines' positions. The arrival of the helicopter formation changed everything about the tactical dynamic in Devil's Canyon. The Apache helicopters immediately began engaging enemy positions with 30 mm cannon fire and Hellfire missiles, forcing the Taliban fighters to abandon their assault positions and seek shelter from the devastating aerial attack. Maria used the confusion created by the air assault to move toward Delta Company's position, where she could see Marines preparing colored smoke grenades to mark their location for the rescue helicopters. The sight of Lieutenant Colonel Harrison being carried toward the landing zone by 2 of his Marines confirmed that he had survived the night despite his serious injuries. All Marines, this is Rescue 1. We have positive identification on friendly positions and are beginning extraction operations. Maintain your current positions and prepare for immediate evacuation, came the transmission from the lead helicopter, its pilot navigating skillfully between the canyon walls while under sporadic enemy fire. The extraction of Delta Company's wounded proceeded with military efficiency despite the challenging conditions. The Chinook helicopter hovered just above the rocky terrain, while Marines quickly loaded the casualties aboard, protected by devastating suppressive fire from the Apache helicopters that eliminated any enemy fighters who attempted to interfere with the operation. Maria reached the landing zone just as the helicopter lifted off with its load of wounded Marines, including Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who gave her a weak thumbs-up signal from his stretcher as the aircraft climbed toward safety. The sight of her fellow Marines being successfully evacuated provided the first moment of hope she had experienced since the engagement began. But the rescue operation was only half complete, and Charlie Company remained trapped on the opposite ridge under continued enemy fire. The helicopter formation immediately began maneuvering toward the south ridge, but the approach was more difficult due to the terrain and the concentration of enemy anti-aircraft weapons in that area. Rodriguez, this is Rescue 1. We need you to provide fire support for Charlie Company's extraction. Enemy forces are concentrated around their position, and we need suppressive fire to keep them pinned down during the landing, transmitted the helicopter pilot, apparently having been briefed on her presence and activities throughout the night. Maria positioned herself to provide overwatch for Charlie Company's evacuation, using her sidearm and the limited rifle ammunition she had recovered from eliminated enemy fighters. The range was longer than optimal for pistol fire, but she could still engage targets that posed immediate threats to the landing helicopters. The extraction of Charlie Company proved more challenging than Delta Company's evacuation due to the number of wounded Marines and the intensity of enemy fire directed at the landing zone. Major Williams remained unconscious and required careful handling during her transfer to the helicopter, while the other wounded Marines needed assistance to reach the aircraft. Maria provided covering fire from her position, engaging enemy fighters who attempted to move closer to the landing zone or establish firing positions that could threaten the hovering helicopter. Her shooting was necessarily rapid and less precise than her usual sniper work, but it was effective in disrupting enemy attempts to interfere with the evacuation. At 11:15 hours, the final helicopter lifted off from Charlie Company's position with all remaining Marines aboard. Maria watched the aircraft climb safely out of the canyon while Apache helicopters continued to suppress enemy positions, ensuring that the rescue formation could escape without being engaged by anti-aircraft weapons. The sound of helicopter rotors fading into the distance left an eerie silence in Devil's Canyon, broken only by the occasional crack of rifle fire as enemy fighters attempted to locate Maria's position. She was now alone in the canyon with several hundred Taliban fighters, armed only with a pistol and whatever ammunition she could scavenge from the battlefield. The logical choice was to attempt escape through one of the canyon's exits, hoping to evade enemy patrols and reach friendly territory before her water and ammunition were exhausted. But Maria realized that her continued presence in the canyon served an important tactical purpose beyond her own survival. As long as the enemy fighters remained focused on locating and eliminating her, they could not reorganize their forces for operations against other Marine units in the region. Every hour she remained active in the canyon was another hour that nearby Marine positions were safe from the large enemy force that had been assembled for the assault on Devil's Canyon. Maria's decision to continue fighting rather than attempting escape was made easier by her assessment of the tactical situation. The canyon's exits were heavily guarded, and her chances of successful evasion were minimal given her limited supplies and the number of enemy fighters searching for her. More importantly, she had intercepts indicating that additional Taliban reinforcements were moving toward the canyon, apparently planning to use it as a staging area for attacks on Marine positions throughout the region. Her continued presence could disrupt these plans and provide valuable intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions. At 11:30 hours, Maria established a new position in a complex of caves and rock formations that provided excellent concealment and multiple escape routes. From this location, she could observe most of the canyon while remaining hidden from enemy patrols, and the rocky terrain would make it difficult for enemy forces to assault her position even if they located it. The psychological warfare campaign that she had initiated during the night continued throughout the afternoon, with carefully placed shots designed to maintain enemy uncertainty about her capabilities and location. She avoided patterns that might allow the enemy to predict her position, instead moving constantly and engaging targets from unexpected angles and ranges. By mid-afternoon, Maria observed that the enemy force was showing signs of decreased morale and unit cohesion. Constant pressure from an unlocated sniper had taken its toll on the fighters, many of whom were now moving cautiously and showing reluctance to expose themselves unnecessarily to potential sniper fire. The arrival of enemy reinforcements at 1400 hours temporarily restored aggressive patrolling, but Maria's engagement of the new force's leadership quickly reduced their effectiveness as well. She had learned to identify tactical leaders by their behavior and equipment, making them priority targets whenever they exposed themselves to observation. Around 1600 hours, Maria intercepted radio communications indicating that the enemy force was considering withdrawing from the canyon due to their inability to locate and eliminate the sniper who had been harassing them throughout the engagement. The psychological impact of her continued presence had exceeded her most optimistic expectations. However, the communications also indicated that higher-level Taliban commanders were questioning the competence of the local leadership, and that additional resources were being committed to eliminating what they perceived as a significant threat to their operational security. As the sun began to set on her second day in Devil's Canyon, Maria reflected on the series of events that had brought her to this point. Her decision to disobey evacuation orders had saved the lives of 11 wounded Marines who would otherwise have been killed or captured by enemy forces. But the larger battle was far from over, and she knew that the enemy would continue to commit resources to eliminating her until they succeeded or she found a way to escape the canyon. The next 24 hours would determine whether her defiance of orders would be remembered as heroic sacrifice or tactical foolishness. As darkness fell over the canyon once again, Maria prepared for another night of combat against impossible odds. She had successfully saved her fellow Marines, but her own survival remained very much in doubt. The Taliban fighters were learning from their mistakes, and their next assault would likely be better planned and more difficult to counter. The battle for Devil's Canyon had become a personal duel between one Marine sniper and several hundred enemy fighters, with the outcome still uncertain despite the successful evacuation of the wounded. Maria Rodriguez had proven that a single individual could make a significant difference in combat, but the ultimate test of her skills and determination was yet to come. The second night in Devil's Canyon brought new challenges that tested the limits of Maria's physical and psychological endurance. Dehydration was becoming a serious problem, as her water supplies were nearly exhausted, and the intense heat of the Afghan desert had taken its toll throughout the day. Her ammunition situation was equally critical, with only 2 magazines remaining for her recovered rifle and half a magazine for her sidearm. But the most significant change was in the enemy's approach to locating and eliminating her. The Taliban fighters had clearly received additional training or leadership because their search patterns were more systematic, and their tactical discipline had improved markedly since the previous night. Around 2100 hours, Maria observed enemy forces establishing what appeared to be a cordon around the entire canyon, with sentries positioned at regular intervals along all possible escape routes. This development confirmed her assessment that escape would be virtually impossible and that her options were limited to continuing the fight or attempting to evade capture until her supplies were completely exhausted. The enemy's new tactical approach became clear when thermal imaging equipment appeared among their search teams. The sophisticated technology suggested that Taliban commanders had committed significant resources to eliminating her, possibly including advisors or equipment from foreign sources. Maria's knowledge of thermal imaging capabilities forced her to modify her concealment techniques significantly. Traditional camouflage and terrain features that had hidden her from visual observation were useless against thermal sensors, requiring her to seek positions near heat sources that would mask her thermal signature. At 22:30 hours, the first thermal imaging team approached her position among the rocky caves where she had established her latest hide. Through careful observation, Maria could see that the team consisted of 4 fighters carrying what appeared to be military-grade thermal imaging equipment, escorted by a security element of 8 additional fighters. The elimination of the thermal imaging team required Maria to expose herself to significant risk, as she needed to get close enough to ensure accurate shooting while avoiding the thermal sensors that would detect her approach. She waited until the team was positioned among the rocks below her cave system before initiating her attack. Her first shot eliminated the thermal imaging operator before he could identify her heat signature among the complex thermal patterns created by the sun-heated rocks. The immediate confusion that followed allowed her to eliminate 2 additional team members before the survivors could organize effective return fire. But the engagement had revealed her approximate location to enemy forces throughout the canyon, and Maria could hear radio traffic coordinating a massive response to surround her position. She estimated that at least 100 fighters were moving to establish a perimeter that would prevent her escape from the cave complex. The tactical situation forced Maria to abandon her defensive position and attempt to break through the closing enemy cordon before it became completely sealed. The movement required her to cross approximately 200 meters of open terrain while under observation from multiple enemy positions. Maria's escape from the cave complex was accomplished through a combination of speed, deception, and accurate shooting that utilized her remaining ammunition with maximum efficiency. She eliminated sentries who blocked her movement route while using smoke grenades recovered from abandoned marine equipment to obscure her movement from enemy observation. The running firefight that followed tested every aspect of her combat training and physical conditioning. Enemy fighters pursued her through the rocky terrain while maintaining radio contact to coordinate their movements, forcing Maria to change direction multiple times to avoid being surrounded. Around midnight, Maria reached a defensive position in a narrow ravine that provided excellent protection from direct fire while offering only limited approaches for enemy assault forces. The position was tactically sound for defensive operations, but it was also a potential trap if enemy forces managed to establish positions commanding the ravine's exits. From her new position, Maria could observe that the enemy force was indeed attempting to surround the ravine while maintaining security against the sniper fire that had proven so effective throughout the engagement. Their movements were cautious and well coordinated, suggesting that they had finally developed tactics that could potentially counter her advantages in marksmanship and battlefield awareness. At 0100 hours, Maria's situation became critical when enemy forces succeeded in establishing blocking positions at both ends of the ravine. The mathematical calculation was simple. She was trapped in a position with limited ammunition, no water, and no realistic possibility of escape or rescue. But the psychological impact of her continued resistance was evident in the enemy's behavior. Instead of launching an immediate assault that would have overwhelmed her position, they maintained their cordon while apparently waiting for additional resources or different tactical options to be implemented. Maria used this tactical pause to assess her remaining options and resources. Her ammunition was sufficient for perhaps 30 minutes of sustained combat, her water was completely exhausted, and she had been without food for over 24 hours. Physical exhaustion was beginning to affect her shooting accuracy and tactical decision-making. The arrival of additional enemy reinforcements at 0200 hours brought the total force in the canyon to approximately 600 fighters, along with heavy weapons and communication equipment that suggested a major tactical operation. Maria realized that her continued presence had escalated the situation far beyond a local engagement between Marines and Taliban fighters. Through intercepted radio communications, she learned that her activities in Devil's Canyon had attracted attention at the highest levels of Taliban command structure. The organization's leadership was apparently concerned that a single American sniper had successfully disrupted a major operation and inflicted significant casualties on their forces. The psychological implications were significant. Maria's defiance had become symbolic of American military effectiveness and Taliban tactical inadequacy. Her capture or death had become a matter of organizational prestige that justified the commitment of substantial resources to the Canyon operation. At 0300 hours, the enemy launched their final assault on Maria's position using tactics that reflected professional military planning. Diversionary attacks from multiple directions preceded the main assault, which was supported by heavy weapons fire designed to suppress her ability to engage the advancing fighters. Maria's defense of the ravine position utilized every round of her remaining ammunition with surgical precision. Each shot was aimed to eliminate specific threats while maximizing the psychological impact on the advancing enemy forces. Her shooting remained accurate despite exhaustion and the effects of dehydration, but the overwhelming numerical superiority of the attacking force made the outcome inevitable. As her ammunition was finally exhausted, Maria prepared for the hand-to-hand combat that would mark the final phase of her resistance. Her combat knife was the only weapon remaining, and she had no illusions about her chances against several dozen enemy fighters. The moment that would define the rest of her life came at 0345 hours, when the first enemy fighters reached her position among the rocks at the head of the ravine. Maria's transition from sniper to close-quarters combatant was seamless, using her knife and hand-to-hand combat training to continue the fight even after her ranged weapons were exhausted. The close-quarters battle was brief but intense, with Maria eliminating 3 enemy fighters before being overwhelmed by the numerical superiority of the attacking force. Her capture came only after she had been wounded by multiple gunshot wounds that left her unable to continue active resistance. But even in captivity, Maria's impact on the tactical situation continued. Enemy forces remained focused on the canyon, while higher-level Taliban commanders debated how to handle the propaganda implications of capturing an American female sniper who had inflicted such significant casualties on their forces. The debate was resolved by events beyond Taliban control when a massive marine rescue operation commenced at 0600 hours. Intelligence assets had tracked the concentration of enemy forces in Devil's Canyon, and Marine commanders recognized that such a large Taliban force represented both a threat and an opportunity for a decisive engagement. The rescue operation involved 3 Marine battalions, supported by extensive air power, artillery, and special operations forces. The objective was not merely to rescue Maria, but to eliminate the entire enemy force that had been assembled in the canyon for what intelligence indicated was a planned offensive against Marine positions throughout the region. Maria's capture location was identified through signals intelligence and aerial reconnaissance, allowing rescue forces to plan a precise operation that would minimize the risk to her while maximizing the destruction of enemy forces. The operation commenced with massive artillery and airstrikes that eliminated enemy heavy weapons in command positions. The ground assault that followed was swift and overwhelming, with Marine forces advancing from multiple directions while special operations teams moved directly toward Maria's location. Enemy resistance collapsed quickly under the intensity of the coordinated attack, with many fighters attempting to escape through routes that had been blocked by supporting units. Maria's rescue came at 0830 hours when Marines from Force Reconnaissance reached her position and provided immediate medical attention for her wounds. Her first words to her rescuers were a request for information about the status of the Marines she had stayed behind to protect, demonstrating that her priorities remained focused on her fellow Marines even after her ordeal. The evacuation helicopter that carried Maria to medical treatment also transported the news that Lieutenant Colonel Harrison and all other wounded Marines had survived their injuries and were recovering at military hospitals. Major Williams had awakened from her unconsciousness and was expected to make a full recovery, while the other wounded Marines were all stable and receiving appropriate care. The tactical and strategic implications of Maria's actions extended far beyond the immediate rescue of wounded Marines. Her solo resistance in Devil's Canyon had disrupted a major Taliban offensive, led to the elimination of a significant enemy force, and provided valuable intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions. The psychological impact on both friendly and enemy forces was equally significant. Maria's willingness to disobey orders to save fellow Marines had reinforced the Marine Corps' reputation for loyalty and determination, while demonstrating to enemy forces that American military personnel would not abandon their comrades regardless of tactical disadvantages. 6 months later, Maria Rodriguez stood at attention in the Rose Garden of the White House as the President of the United States presented her with the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. The citation recognized her extraordinary heroism in saving the lives of 11 fellow Marines while engaging several hundred enemy fighters over a period of 48 hours. But for Maria, the true meaning of her actions was found not in official recognition, but in the letters she received from the families of the Marines she had saved. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's children thanked her for bringing their father home, while Major Williams wrote that her newborn daughter would grow up knowing that heroes really do exist. The tactical lessons learned from the Devil's Canyon engagement were incorporated into Marine Corps training and doctrine, emphasizing the importance of individual initiative and the tactical impact that a single well-trained Marine could achieve under extreme circumstances. Elena Rodriguez stood beside her sister during the White House ceremony, tears streaming down her face as she watched Maria receive the nation's highest honor. The promise that Maria had made to return home for Christmas had been kept, albeit several months late and after experiences that neither sister could have imagined. As Maria returned to active duty following her recovery, she carried with her the knowledge that sometimes the most important military decisions are made not by generals or politicians, but by individual soldiers who must choose between following orders and following their conscience. In Devil's Canyon, Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had chosen conscience, and 11 Marines were alive because of that choice. The legacy of her actions would continue long after her military service ended, inspiring future generations of Marines to remember that the true meaning of military service lies not in blind obedience to orders, but in the willingness to sacrifice everything to protect fellow warriors and uphold the values that make military service meaningful. The battle for Devil's Canyon had ended with a victory that was measured not in territory gained or enemies killed, but in lives saved and principles upheld. Maria Rodriguez had proven that sometimes one person really can make a difference, regardless of the odds or the obstacles that stand in their way.